January 17, 1945. Luzon, Philippines. 0427 hours. The night is thick with tropical moisture. A young American radar operator named Private James Kellerman sits hunched over a glowing green screen in a canvas tent erected on a muddy hillside overlooking the South China Sea. The catheter ray tube flickers with electronic snow. His fingers rest on the manual tuning dial, making micro-adjustments every few seconds. Outside, the jungle breathes. Insects hum in waves. Palm fronds rustle in the pre-dawn wind. The air smells of canvas, cigarette smoke, and the metallic tang of electronic equipment running hot in the humidity. Kellerman's eyes ache. He has been staring at that phosphorescent glow for 6 hours straight. Then, at 0431 hours, something changes. A cluster of blips materializes on the screen's upper quadrant. Faint at first, then solidify into distinct points of light. Kellerman's heart rate spikes. He counts them quickly. 12 no, 15 contacts, bearing 270 degrees, range 82 miles, altitude estimated at 9,000 feet, speed approximately 220 knots. He reaches for the field telephone, hands steady despite the adrenaline now flooding his bloodstream. Plot. This is Station Fox 7. Multiple bogies inbound. Vector 270. 82 miles. Confirming hostile profile. The voice on the other end is calm, rehearsed. Copy Fox 7. Scrambling intercept. Kellerman does not take his eyes off the screen. Those blips represent human beings. Japanese pilots and Mitsubishi bombers, flying through darkness toward American positions, entirely unaware that they have already been seen, tracked, cataloged, and condemned. This is the invisible war, the electromagnetic battlefield where victory is determined not by courage or firepower, but by who sees first. And in the vast theater of the Pacific, stretching across 10,000 miles of ocean and jungle, the United States military constructed the most sophisticated detection network ever conceived in human history, a lattice of radar stations, radio relays, fighter direction centers, and command posts that transformed the chaos of aerial warfare into a choreographed ballet of interception and annihilation. The Japanese, fly into what they believed was a shroud of night, were in fact flying into a web of radio waves that had been tracking them since they lifted off from their airfields in Formosa. But this technological supremacy was not inevitable. It was built, piece by painstaking piece, out of scientific innovation, industrial might, operational doctrine, and the blood of young men who learned to trust machines more than their own eyes. In the spring of 1942, the Pacific War was catastrophe for the United States. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore, supposedly impregnable, had surrendered to a Japanese force that advanced on bicycles. Wake Island, Guam, the Dutch East Indies, all swallowed by the rising tide of Japanese conquest. American naval power, the backbone of Pacific strategy, had been gutted in a single morning. What remained were scattered carrier groups, demoralized ground forces, and a defensive perimeter that seemed to shrink with every passing week. Japanese pilots, flush with victory, spoke of the Americans as soft, industrialized, dependent on material comfort rather than fighting spirit. They had been taught that the decadent West could not match the purity of Bushido, the warrior's code. Early encounters seemed to confirm this belief. American planes were often obsolete, their pilots undertrained, their tactics hesitant. But beneath the surface, a different kind of war was being waged, one fought not in the skies but in laboratories, engineering workshops, and classified development programs scattered across the continental United States. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a secretive organization called the Radiation Laboratory employed over 4,000 scientists and engineers working on a single problem: perfecting microwave radar. At Naval Research Laboratory facilities in Washington, military technicians tested prototype systems capable of detecting aircraft at ranges previously thought impossible. At training schools in Florida and California, radar operators, many of them barely out of high school, learned to interpret the ghostly signatures on cathode ray tubes, distinguishing between rain squalls and bomber formations, between friendly aircraft and incoming threats. Radar itself was not new. The British had used it to devastating effect during the Battle of Britain. giving RAF Fighter Command the critical minutes needed to scramble interceptors before Luftwaffe bombers reached English cities. But the Pacific presented challenges that Europe did not. Distances were immense. Islands were scattered across vast oceanic expanses with no road networks, no permanent infrastructure, no electrical grids. Radar sets had to be portable, durable, capable of operating in 100-degree heat and 90% humidity, resistant to saltwater corrosion and fungal growth. They had to be powered by generators that could run on irregular fuel supplies. They had to be installed on mountain tops, beaches, jungle clearings, anywhere that offered line of sight to the horizon, and they had to be integrated into a network. A single radar station, no matter how powerful, was merely a sensor, but dozens of stations linked by radio and telephone, feeding data into centralized plotting rooms where trained controllers could synthesize information and direct interceptors in real time. That was a weapon system. That was the edge. The Japanese pilots expected anonymity. They had been raised in a military culture that emphasized spiritual preparation over technological reliance. Before a mission, they would purify themselves, write farewell letters to their families, and meditate on the inevitability of death. The Zero fighter, fast, maneuverable, stripped of armor to save weight, embodied this philosophy. It was a plane designed for offensive action, for the decisive engagement, for the pilot who accepted that survival was secondary to mission accomplishment. Japanese bomber crews flying toward American targets in 1942 and 1943 often believed that surprise was their greatest weapon. They flew at night or at dawn, using cloud cover in the vastness of the ocean to mask their approach. They trusted in the darkness. But darkness, by 1944, had become obsolete. On Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands, the United States established one of the first fully integrated radar networks in the Pacific. The island had been taken at enormous cost. Months of brutal jungle fighting, naval battles that turned the waters off the coast into a graveyard known as Iron Bottom Sound. But once secured, Guadalcanal became a laboratory for a new kind of warfare. Radar stations were positioned on hilltops across the island, their antennas rotating slowly, sweeping the sky with invisible beams of electromagnetic energy. Operators worked in shifts, watching their screens with fanatical attention. When Japanese bombers launched from Rabaul, hundreds of miles to the northwest, they were detected within minutes of takeoff. Fighter controllers at Henderson Field received immediate alerts. Wildcats and Corsairs were scrambled, vectored directly toward the incoming formations. The Japanese pilots, who expected to arrive over their targets unopposed, instead found themselves swarmed by American fighters at altitude, often before they even sighted the coast. One such engagement occurred on June 16, 1943. A formation of 18 Mitsubishi G4M bombers, known to the Americans as Bettys, departed Rabaul before dawn, bound for Guadalcanal. The crews were experienced veterans of earlier campaigns. They flew in tight formation, their gunners scanning the sky for threats. They expected to reach Guadalcanal around 0600 hours, catch the Americans during breakfast, and depart before effective resistance could be organized. But at 0512 hours, Radar Station Delta 3, positioned on a ridgeline above Lunga Point, detected the formation at a range of 94 miles. The operator, a corporal from Ohio named William Hatch, logged the contact and immediately relayed coordinates to the Fighter Direction Center. Within 3 minutes, 12 F-4U Corsairs were lifting off from Henderson Field, climbing hard toward 20,000 feet. The Japanese bombers were still 70 miles out when the Corsairs reached intercept altitude. The American pilots, guided by radio updates from ground controllers, positioned themselves above and ahead of the enemy formation, using the rising sun to mask their approach. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. 16 of the 18 Japanese bombers were shot down. The remaining 2, badly damaged, jettisoned their ordnance over empty ocean and limped back toward Rabaul. One crashed on landing. Not a single American aircraft was lost. The Japanese pilots, in their final moments, must have experienced profound disorientation. How had the Americans known? How had they been waiting, positioned perfectly, as if the entire flight path had been predicted? They had been predicted, not by clairvoyance, but by mathematics and radio waves. The symbolic object of this war was not a weapon, but a screen, a small circular, glowing green window into a realm of invisible physics. For the young men who operated radar systems, farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college students who had studied physics or engineering, that screen represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. Previous generations of soldiers had relied on eyes and ears, on the visceral experience of seeing the enemy, hearing the engines, feeling concussion of explosions. Radar operators experienced combat as abstraction. The enemy was a blip, a coordinate, a data point to be communicated to higher command. There was no adrenaline rush of close combat, no terror of seeing the enemy's face, just a quiet tension of watching a screen in a dim tent, knowing that the information you provided would determine whether men lived or died. But that abstraction was also a kind of power. The radar operator, in a very real sense, controlled the battlefield. He could see things that pilots could not. He could track multiple formations simultaneously, estimate altitudes and speeds, predict intercept points, assess threats. In the hands of a skilled controller, radar transformed aerial combat from a chaotic melee into a chess game. American fighter pilots, initially skeptical of being vectored by ground controllers they could not see, gradually learned to trust the disembodied voices on their radios. Those voices, guided by radar, saved their lives. The Japanese, for their part, were slow to recognize the revolution occurring around them. Japanese radar technology lagged behind American and British systems by years. Cultural factors played a role. Japanese military doctrine emphasized offensive spirit and downplayed defensive measures. Resources were scarce. Japan's industrial base, already stretched thin by the demands of a multi-front war, could not match American production of radar sets, radio equipment, and the complex infrastructure required to support them. But there was also a cognitive barrier. Japanese commanders, trained in a tradition that valued audacity and fighting spirit, found it difficult to accept that an invisible mechanical system could fundamentally alter the balance of power. Even after repeated disasters, bombers intercepted before reaching their targets, supply convoys ambushed at sea, night attacks that ended in slaughter. Some Japanese officers attributed their losses to bad luck or superior American numbers, rather than to a technological disadvantage they did not fully understand. By 1944, the American radar network in the Pacific had evolved into a vast, multi-layered organism. Long-range search radars, mounted on hilltops and coastal promontories, scanned the horizon for contacts at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Height-finding radars determined the altitude of incoming aircraft with precision. Ground-controlled intercept stations, equipped with the latest SER 584 sets, capable of tracking targets with remarkable accuracy, guided night fighters onto enemy bombers that once would have operated with impunity under cover of darkness. Shipborne radar allowed naval task forces to detect air attacks hours before visual contact, giving carriers time to launch combat air patrols and position defensive fighters. Radar picket ships, stationed far in advance of the main fleet, acted as early warning sentinels, their operators scanning empty ocean for first electronic whisper of an approaching raid. The infrastructure required to support this system was staggering. Radar sets were delicate, complex machines, prone to failure in the harsh conditions of the Pacific. Vacuum tubes burned out. Power supplies failed. Antennas were damaged by storms. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, cannibalizing parts from damaged units, improvising repairs with whatever materials were available. Supply chains stretched across thousands of miles, from factories in the United States to forward operating bases on coral atolls barely large enough to accommodate an airstrip. The logistical miracle that kept American forces fed, armed, and equipped also kept the radar network operational, a web of supply ships, transport aircraft, and warehouses filled with spare parts, technical manuals, and the endless stream of material that modern technological warfare demanded. And then there were the people. Thousands of radar operators, plotters, controllers, technicians, communication specialists, most of them in their late teens or early 20s, trained in a matter of months, thrust into roles that required intense concentration, technical proficiency, and the ability to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. They worked in windowless tents, concrete bunkers, steel-walled rooms aboard ships. They breathed stale air thick with cigarette smoke and the ozone smell of electrical equipment. They stared at screens until their eyes watered, listening to the hiss of radio static, the crackle of distant voices, the rhythmic ping of the radar sweep. They missed meals, lost sleep, developed headaches, and eye strain. They were not glamorous. No newsreel celebrated their work. No medals were pinned to their chests in public ceremonies. But they won the war one blip at a time. April 7, 1945. Off the coast of Okinawa, the largest kamikaze attack of the war is inbound. Japanese commanders, desperate to halt the American advance, have assembled over 300 aircraft for a massive suicide strike against the invasion fleet. Pilots, many of them barely trained teenagers, have been given minimal fuel, enough to reach Okinawa, but not enough to return. They have written their final letters, tied ceremonial headbands around their foreheads, and taken off from airfields across Kyushu. Their mission is simple: crash into American ships, destroy as many as possible, accept death as the ultimate expression of loyalty to the Emperor. But the Americans are waiting. Radar picket destroyers, stationed 50 miles from the main fleet, detect the first wave at 1,430 hours. The contacts appear on screens as a swarm, so dense that individual aircraft cannot be distinguished. Controllers aboard the radar pickets immediately broadcast warnings. Aboard carriers and battleships, air defense officers sound general quarters. Fighter directors scramble every available aircraft, Hellcats, Corsairs, even Marine night fighters. Within minutes, over 400 American planes are airborne, forming a layer defense that extends from the outer radar picket line to the fleet itself. The Japanese pilots, flying low to evade radar detection, nevertheless find themselves intercepted far from their targets. American fighters, guided by radar controllers who track both friendly and enemy aircraft simultaneously, tear into the kamikaze formations with coordinated attacks. Hellcats dive from above. Corsairs attack from the flanks. The sky becomes a chaotic slaughterhouse. Japanese planes, many of them obsolete trainers or obsolete bombers pressed into suicide service, burn and fall in spiraling pyres. Some pilots, seeing the impossibility of reaching the fleet, attempt to crash into the radar picket ships. Easier targets, closer at hand. The destroyers, equipped with their own fire control radars, engage with 5-inch guns, automatic cannons, machine guns. The water around the ships erupts in geysers of white foam and black smoke. By the time the attack ends, over 200 Japanese aircraft have been destroyed. 16 American ships have been hit, several severely damaged. But the fleet itself, the carriers of battleships, the transports carrying troops and supplies for the Okinawa invasion, remains intact. The radar network has done its job. It has detected the threat, organized a defense, and turned what might have been a catastrophic surprise attack into a manageable engagement. That night, aboard the carriers, pilots return exhausted, their planes scarred by bullet holes and shrapnel. They climb out of their cockpits, remove their helmets, light cigarettes. They do not speak much. There is nothing to say. They have seen men die, young men, barely older than children, who flew towards certain death with fanatical determination. But those men died far from their targets, their sacrifice rendered futile by invisible radio waves and the men who interpreted them. The transformation was not merely tactical. It was psychological, ideological. For the Japanese military, raised in a tradition that emphasized spiritual purity and self-sacrifice, the failure of kamikaze attacks was more than a strategic defeat. It was a challenge to the very philosophy that had sustained them. If willingness to die was not enough, if courage, determination, and devotion to the Emperor could be negated by machines operated by unseen technicians, then what was the value of Bushido? What meaning did their sacrifices hold? American soldiers, for their part, experienced a different kind of transformation. They had entered the war believing in American ingenuity, in the superiority of democratic systems, in the power of industrial production. Radar confirmed those beliefs in the most concrete terms. It was proof that free societies, which encouraged scientific inquiry, rewarded innovation, and trusted young men with responsibility, could produce technologies that authoritarian regimes could not match. The radar screen, glowing in a darkened tent on Pacific Island, became a symbol of modernity itself, of rational thought, empirical evidence, technological progress. It was Enlightenment miniaturized and weaponized. But there was also a cost. The men who fought this war of abstraction, who reduced human beings to blips on a screen, who calculated vectors and altitudes and intercept angles, carried a different burden than previous generations of soldiers. They did not see the faces of the men they killed. They did not hear their screams or smell the burning flesh. They experienced war as information, as data processed and transmitted. Some found this easier to bear. Others found it haunting in a different way, a sense that something essential had been lost, that war had become so mechanized, so impersonal, that the ancient rituals of combat, the recognition of shared humanity between warriors, had been erased. Private James Kellerman, who detected that formation of Japanese bombers on January 17, 1945, survived the war. He returned to the United States in the autumn of 1945, was discharged in November, and enrolled at a technical college in Pennsylvania using the GI Bill. He studied electrical engineering. He married, had children, worked for a defense contractor developing early computer systems. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did not talk about fear or courage or the thrill of combat. He talked about the screen, the glowing green screen, and the blips that appeared on it, and the weight of knowing that those blips were men flying toward their deaths, and that he was the first person on Earth to know they were coming. By the summer of 1945, Japan's air defenses had collapsed. American bombers flew over Japanese cities in broad daylight, often unopposed. 29 superfortresses, guided by radar navigation systems, dropped incendiary bombs with methodical precision. Japanese radar networks, always inferior to their American counterparts, had been systematically destroyed by months of bombing and fighter sweeps. Air defense fighters, starved of fuel and flown by undertrained pilots, were swatted from the sky. The electromagnetic spectrum, once contested, now belonged entirely to the United States. On August 6, 1945, a lone B-29 named Enola Gay approached Hiroshima. It was detected by Japanese radar operators, who noted the single aircraft and decided it was not worth scrambling interceptors. Lone B-29s often flew reconnaissance missions, and fuel was too precious to waste on single targets. The radar operators watched the blip cross their screens, tracking it as it neared the city, then passed overhead. Moments later, the atomic bomb detonated. The radar stations closest to Hiroshima went offline instantly, their equipment vaporized, their operators dead. Stations farther away detected a massive electromagnetic pulse, then silence. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another lone B-29, another radar contact dismissed as insignificant. Another city erased in a flash of nuclear fire. The radar operators who tracked those planes, those final apocalyptic blips, did not know what they were witnessing. They saw only what they had seen 1,000 times before, an aircraft entering their airspace, following a predictable course. They could not have imagined that those blips represented the end of an age, the beginning of something new and terrible. In the decades after the war, radar technology became ubiquitous. It guided commercial aircraft, tracked weather systems, regulated traffic, enabled space exploration. The military systems developed in the Pacific, the networks of sensors, the centralized command and control, the doctrine of detecting and engaging threats before they reached their targets, evolved into the Cold War's early warning systems, the ballistic missile defenses, the satellite constellations that now ring the Earth. The glowing green screen became the foundation of modernity. But in 1945, on a hillside in Luzon or a coral atoll in the Central Pacific, radar was still new, still miraculous. The young men who operated it understood that they were part of something unprecedented. They were not warriors in the traditional sense. They did not close with the enemy, did not test their courage in hand-to-hand combat, but they won battles nonetheless. They saved lives, American lives, the lives of pilots who did not have to fly into ambushes, of sailors who did not have to face surprise attacks, of soldiers who did not have to endure bombardment because the bombers never arrived. And they took lives, thousands of them. Japanese pilots who flew into radar nets like insects into spider webs, who died bewildered, ambushed by enemies they never saw, guided to their doom by invisible forces they did not understand. The Japanese soldiers expected anonymity, the cover of darkness, the protective vastness of the Pacific. They expected to rely on skill, courage, spiritual purity, the intangible qualities that military tradition had always celebrated. They believed that these qualities would be enough. But the Americans had built something that transcended tradition. They had industrialized perception itself. They had turned the invisible into the visible, had collapsed distance and time, had made the empty sky into a battlefield where every aircraft, every movement, every intention could be seen, tracked, and countered. They had applied the principles of mass production, standardization, systematization, coordination, to the act of seeing. And in doing so, they had made obsolete an entire philosophy of warfare. This was not just a technological advantage. It was a manifestation of deeper cultural forces. American society, for all its flaws, was built on principles that encouraged innovation. It rewarded practical problem solving over rigid adherence to tradition. It educated its citizens broadly, teaching them to read technical manuals, operate complex machinery, think critically about systems and processes. It trusted young men, teenagers, many of them, with sophisticated equipment and significant responsibility. And it had the industrial capacity to produce that equipment in quantities that other nations could not match. Radar sets rolled off assembly lines in the same factories that built radios, televisions, refrigerators. The skills required to manufacture consumer goods translated directly into military production. The same engineers who designed automobile engines designed radar transmitters. The same workers who assembled household appliances assembled fire control systems. Japan, by contrast, had industrialized rapidly but incompletely. Its economy remained dependent on imported raw materials, particularly oil and rubber, which the war had cut off. Its educational system, while producing disciplined soldiers, did not emphasize the kind of broad technical literacy that allowed American soldiers to maintain and operate complex systems. Its military culture, rooted in Bushido and the traditions of the samurai, struggled to adapt to the realities of modern, mechanized warfare. Japanese industry could produce excellent weapons, the Zero fighter, the long lance torpedo, but could not produce them in the quantities required, nor could support them with the vast logistical infrastructure that modern war demanded. The radar screen, glowing in the Pacific darkness, symbolized this asymmetry. It was a window into the future, a future where information would matter more than courage, where detection would matter more than firepower, where the side that could see first and farthest would win. There's a photograph, taken in the summer of 1945, of a radar operator aboard the USS Enterprise. His name is not recorded. He sits at his station, headphones clamped over his ears, eyes fixed on the scope. The light from the screen illuminates his face, washing out detail, turning him into a study in contrast, bright green glow and deep shadow. His expression is neutral, focused. He could be monitoring an empty sky, or tracking a formation of kamikazes bearing down on the fleet. The photograph does not reveal which, but the image captures something essential about the war in the Pacific, about the nature of technological conflict, about the young men who fought it. He is not heroic in the traditional sense. He does not carry a rifle, does not storm a beach, does not engage in hand-to-hand combat, but he is no less a warrior. He is the new kind of warrior, the warrior of the information age, the man who fights with his mind and his eyes, who interprets data and makes decisions that ripple across hundreds of miles, that determine the fates of men he will never meet, and he is utterly alone. Surrounded by shipmates, connected by radio to dozens of other stations, part of a vast network of sensors and controllers and fighters, yet fundamentally isolated, locked in communion with a machine, a screen, a stream of electronic pulses that only he can interpret. This was the cost of technological warfare. This was the price of victory. Not just a physical danger. The kamikazes that occasionally broke through, the bombs that found their targets, but the psychological burden of fighting an enemy as abstraction, of participating in violence without experiencing its visceral reality, of bearing responsibility for death at a distance. The war ended. The radar operators went home. The screens were turned off, the equipment decommissioned or mothballed or shipped to new bases for new conflicts. The tents were struck, the bunkers abandoned. Jungle vines reclaimed the hillsides where antennas had once rotated. Coral atolls, briefly transformed into nodes in a global network, returned to obscurity. But the knowledge remained. The Americans had learned something profound about the nature of modern war, that it would be fought not just with guns and bombs, but with information, with sensors and computers, with systems that could process data faster than human minds. The radar networks of the Pacific were primitive compared to what would come later. The SAGE system of the Cold War, the AWACS aircraft, the satellite constellations, the digital battlefields of the 21st century. But they were the beginning, the proof of concept, the first successful integration of technology and doctrine into a system that fundamentally altered the balance of power. And the Japanese had learned something as well, though the lesson came too late to save them. They had learned that spiritual strength, courage, willingness to die, these were not enough. That the modern world rewarded not purity of heart but mastery of systems, not individual heroism but collective organization, not tradition but innovation. It was a bitter lesson, one that contradicted everything they'd been taught, everything they believed, but it was undeniable. The radar screen, that small glowing circle of green phosphorescence, had rewritten the rules of war, and in doing so, it had revealed a larger truth about the 20th century, about the trajectory of human civilization. The future would belong to those who could see farthest, calculate fastest, integrate information most effectively. The future will be fought on electromagnetic spectrums and in computer networks, and across data streams invisible to the naked eye. The age of the warrior, in the ancient sense, was over. The age of the technician had begun. And Private James Kellerman, sitting at a station in the darkness before dawn, watching blips materialize on his screen, had been present at the birth of that new age. He did not know it at the time. He was simply doing his job, following procedures, calling out coordinates. But those blips, those small luminous points of light, were more than Japanese bombers. They were the future made visible for first time. They were the shape of wars to come, of conflicts fought at light speed, of victories determined by microseconds and algorithms. They were the cold, impersonal face of modern violence. And they were, in their way, beautiful. A perfect marriage of physics and purpose, of mathematics and destruction. The screen glowed, the blips moved, and young men, miles away, died without ever knowing they had been seen. This was the gift of radar and its curse. To see without being seen. To know without being known. To kill without hate, without fear, without recognition. To reduce war to geometry. To transform the enemy into data. It was efficient. It was effective. It saved American lives by the thousands. But something was lost. Some ancient compact between warriors. Some acknowledgement of shared humanity. Some recognition that the man you kill was a man with a face and a name and a mother who would grieve. The radar operator never saw that. He saw only the screen, only the blip, only the light. And when the light disappeared, when the interceptors reached their targets, when the guns found their mark, when the bomber fell burning into the sea, the screen returned to empty green glow, featureless and calm, waiting for the next contact, the next threat, the next anonymous enemy to be detected, tracked, and destroyed. This was victory. This was progress. This was the 20th century, in miniature, a glowing screen, a disappearing blip, and a terrible, efficient silence of machines at war.